Good morning. If I can encourage you to take your seats, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Just a few people coming in. My name's Graham West. I'm the CEO of St Vincent de Paul Society Housing, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to Faith Housing Australia, not Alliance's annual event. Thank you for taking the time to come and join us this morning. But before we begin, of course, we are meeting on Aboriginal land. I'm from the lands of the Dharawal people, but we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people. And I'd like to invite Savannah Flynn, Youth Representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, to welcome us to Gadigal land.
So, good morning everyone. My name is Savannah Flynn and I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman originally from Dubbo, New South Wales. I currently just completed my Bachelor of Social Work and first started commencing work with the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Lands Council by going out to sacred sites with youth within our boundaries and making sure they're maintained and untouched. I'm the first youth representative of Metro LAC and have the cultural authority and endorsements under the Aboriginal Lands Right Act for the land we meet on today. It's important to acknowledge that the nation's boundaries covers the Hawkesbury to the north, the Nepean to the west, and the Georges River to the south. A welcome to country is not just a bunch of words, but is spoken from the heart, and in doing this creates a cultural, safe and spiritual environment where everyone is able to take a quick moment to connect and ground with Mother Earth. I would like to pay my respects to all elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to you all here with me today. So on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Lands Council, our board, our members, and especially our elders, our cultural knowledge holders, I would like to welcome you all to the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Savannah, and what an important way to open the day, not only the welcome to country, but also recognition that we bring our heart to ourselves and there's the place of spirituality as well. And that's part of what Faith Housing, I almost said Alliance Australia, is about. It's about people who bring their faith in action, either through the work they do or their support, to actually one of our nation's biggest problems, which is the housing and homelessness crisis. So thank you, Savannah, for welcoming us with those heartfelt words. And congratulations on being the first youth representative too. Thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging a few other VIPs that we have in the room. The Honourable Scott Farlow MLC, Shadow Minister for Housing, Planning and Public Spaces. The Honourable Aileen MacDonald MLC, Shadow Minister for Youth Justice. Jenny Leong MP, Member for Newtown, New South Wales Green Spokesperson for Housing. And can I also acknowledge that this time of year, and Rob and I were just talking about this, as former members of Parliament, is an incredibly busy time for MPs. It's full of school assemblies, it's full of all the things you've got to go and do to get re-elected. So for them to take time out to do this shows their commitment to the cause, and we much appreciate it, so thank you. Can I also acknowledge Chris Valakos, New South Wales Register for Community Housing, Karen Walsh, National Shelter's new interim CEO, leaders from the New South Wales Ecumenical Council, friends from fellow peak bodies, industry and research, many CEOs and senior leaders from across Faith Housing Australia's membership, and Faith Housing Australia's patron, known to many of you, Brian Manane. There's a list of apologies on there, but firstly I want to acknowledge those people. We just have a quick round of applause to acknowledge their service. Today, Faith Housing Australia is also releasing its 2024 annual report and Creating Change Strategy 2025 to 2029. You can download a copy using the QR code in your handout. And I think if you haven't got the handout, there's more up the top. QR codes are very important later on for our session too. So if you haven't worked out how to use a QR code after COVID, time to learn for today. In both documents, we celebrate the impact of our members. Collectively, across our membership, we are supporting over 62,700 people in nearly 50,000 dwellings. And that's a significant contribution to housing. And that's before we extend our footprint to be an Australia-wide body. Today is also a moment of sadness and hope for us as well. Our CEO, Rose Thompson, is undergoing treatment for cancer. She was hoping to be here today, but has had to step back, hence why I'm standing up here doing the MC, but also why I'm about to give her speech as well. She's asked me, though, to convey her deep appreciation for the many messages, calls, gifts she has received from the membership and sector. She's been overwhelmed by the support, and in talking to her earlier in the week, I know that it's made a huge difference to her, so thank you for that. She's also asked me to thank Rob Stokes, our chair, and Amanda Bailey, who I think is known to many of you. And Amanda, raise your hand. You're probably hiding up the back, are you? Head of Advocacy, for stepping up to support over the last month or two. So that's really made a difference. Rose is passionate about the conversation today, I'm sure you know, and thanks Justice Bell for accepting her cajoling to juggle the busy time to be here. Many of you will have heard her speak with determination to see housing legislated as a human right, to negate the challenges of our short Australian electoral cycle, the whims of government as multiple loud voices can distract from a sustained response. She asks you to open your hearts and minds today and choose to engage with Faith Housing Australia post-event to unite as champions for housing justice. I'm now going to read her provocation. So, Nelson Mandela said, "As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest." The faith sector has been providing support in multiple and often invisible ways, so much so that it risks being taken for granted. A hidden pillar, if you will. It is the role of peak bodies like Faith Housing Australia to shine a light on their critical work and of their membership. Imagine a world where the faith housing sector withdrew its social service programs, community housing, schools, hospital, and advocacy. The impact would be profound. Faith communities and organisations fill critical gaps, supporting people who might otherwise be overlooked. Their absence would overwhelm government resources, forcing public agencies to scramble to fill the void. Communities would feel lost deeply. Without the faith sector, many would lose access to essential support systems. Public services would buckle under the strain, leading to longer wait times, reduced quality of care, and a higher cost for taxpayers. The sense of community and belonging fostered by faith-based initiatives would vanish, leaving a void in our social fabric. This is why Faith Housing Australia, as an advocate, an incubator, and a catalyst, is working to support our members to create change. And our members are in for the long haul. Wesley Mission began providing homeless services in New South Wales over 200 years ago, beginning in 1815. Mission Australia's journey started in 1862 when Benjamin Short, moved by the poverty he saw, founded the Sydney City Mission to offer a range of services for disadvantaged individuals. In 1952, the Scalabrinarians arrived to support migrant communities making their homes in Australia. Muslim Women Australia, representing more than 72 ethnicities, has proudly reached its 40-year milestone. Jewish House has just celebrated 40 years too, but on the back of many other iterations of helping the community. Baptist Care has marked 80 years of dedicated service. The Salvation Army, over 144 years, and the St Vincent de Paul Society, over 170 years. These are just a few examples of our members' enduring commitment to people in need. We stand on the shoulders of those who have come before us, continuing their legacy with unwavering dedication. Our annual report attests that our members are providing hope in the housing emergency. All of us, and indeed the broad community housing sector beyond, are concerned with housing Australians. But the scale of the problem is immense. New South Wales citizens living on low incomes have very few options, with research by Anglicare finding less than 1% of rentals were affordable for a person earning the minimum wage. 1%. People receiving income support are the worst affected, with no private market options suitable or affordable for people receiving them. Escalating poverty alongside the housing emergency is causing distress for too many Australians, with large new demographics facing housing insecurity. Research supported by FHA shows that the increase in the rate and severity of housing stress costs New South Wales up to $422 million each year in lost productivity and participation. With 62,577 New South Wales households, that's households, not individuals, so that number is probably over the 90,000 mark in individuals, and even more would qualify but are not on the list. The escalating economic and social costs of the housing emergency require urgent action led by significant and sustained investment in social and affordable housing. Record levels of investment, though, are not enough. We didn't get into this problem overnight, so our efforts to resolve the crisis must be sustained over generations. Short electoral cycles do indeed risk not delivering the coordinated and strategic response needed to repair our broken housing system. One of our thought housing leaders today, Justice Kevin Bell, whom you'll hear from shortly, will challenge us all this morning. He is calling for Australians to realign their values and make housing the great Australian right. A human rights framework guaranteeing all people in Australia access to housing should be the foundation on which we build upon. As we reflect on the immense challenges before us, let us also recognise the incredible power we hold as a united community. Let us commit to being the voices for those who cannot speak, the hands that build a better future, and the hearts that hold compassion at the core of our actions. Together, we can transform the landscape of housing in New South Wales and beyond. Let us leave here today not with just a sense of urgency, but with a renewed commitment to action. Let us be the change makers, the advocates, and the champions of a fairer and more just society. Thank you, Rose, for, in your absence, but leading that provocation and challenge to us all. And you've only got to have walked in today to see that. If you walk through St James Tunnel, you'll not only see that people are sleeping there rough, but the response to the wet weather has actually put people sleeping rough on pallets. And that's not a response that respects human dignity. So we're all called to action here today, and that's why our unfailing chair, Rob Stokes, is going to lead the next session. But Rob, can I invite you up to introduce our next session and also acknowledge Rob personally for his commitment to this area of action, but also to the work he's done in unifying Faith Housing Australia.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, everyone. Today is a day where we get to encourage one another, inspire one another, and to really compel one another on to the cause of justice. Justice in housing and providing housing for everyone, and to do everything with our skills, our values, our capacities to make a difference to the community of which we are part. To start the conversation today, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the Honourable Professor Kevin Bell, AOKC, who has written a very estimable book that challenges us to consider housing as a human right. Before I invite Kevin up to join with me in conversation, I'll take on the role of Martin Parkinson. Was it Martin? Parky anyway. So I'm the bloke who asks the questions. But in introducing Kevin to you, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He's a former Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria, and also a President of the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal. Kevin grew up in social housing in the Melbourne suburb of Moorabbin. He graduated in Arts and Law from Monash University and worked at the Tenants Union of Victoria Victoria before practicing as a barrister for 20 years, including in the Victorian Housing and Residential Tenancies law. As a judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria for 15 years, he wrote many influential judgments on human rights, including the right to housing and home. As a professor in the Faculty of Law at Monash University and director of the Caston Centre for Human Rights Law, he similarly focuses on housing, homelessness and human rights. As I've already indicated, he's now a writer, research and educator in human rights, and adjunct professor of law at Monash University. His latest book that we're inviting him to talk to us about today is Housing, the Great Australian Right. Without further ado, can I invite Kevin up to join me on stage? Welcome. I guess we'll sit together. I've always heard that men talk best together when they're facing in the same direction. That's why we like to fish. So Kevin, you know, a person of your stature, achievement, and contribution would, you know, ordinarily in this season of life be busy acquiring lots and lots of properties. So why are you spending your time talking about how we need to make sure that everyone else has a home?
Well, I've got enough is the short answer. I'm quite comfortable. I live on a judge's pension. I don't need to acquire any more properties. My children are in a bit of a jam, so that's an issue. But I'm certainly not alone in that boat. In this audience, everyone would understand that. But Rob, my commitment to housing goes back to the way I grew up, which you mentioned. Before I go on, I just want to record how moved I was by Rose's speech. That somebody in her position would find the time to speak so deeply and in such a considered way about such an important subject, I find really personally motivating. And I doubt that anything that I'm going to say today will be as important as what she said. And I'd like you to convey to her, if you would, my heartfelt thanks for her words and my best wishes for her speedy recovery.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll pass that on behalf of all of us. Those microphones... that's better. Is your microphone working? Just turn it up. Is that? Yes. Okay.
Yes,
and
thank you.
Up the back, can you hear us all okay? Thank you. Thank you.
So to come back to the answer, I grew up in what was called then public housing. That's to say, directly provided government housing in Moorabbin, which is a bayside suburb of Melbourne. I was born in 1954. Two working poor parents. I was the oldest of what came to be eight children. They were allocated housing by the Housing Commission, as we then called it. That housing I consider to be the foundation for everything I've achieved since. The family struggled. There was little income, but there was a lot of love and a lot of joy and a lot of many other things as young families have. And I am enormously grateful for the opportunity which government-provided housing gave me as an individual, without which I'm quite sure I would not be here. So I took that experience with me through the law into a career which has focused on housing more or less the whole of that period in different ways at different times, and here I am talking about it at this level of morality, at this level of why housing should be a human right.
Okay, well you've opened it, so I'm going to go straight there. That powerful word morality,
yes.
And you talked about housing in terms of values. As a society, we're often uncomfortable talking about values because there's an implicit judgment somewhere in the idea of values, but this audience is comfortable with the idea of talking about values. Yet it's a very confrontational way to talk about housing. Can you unpack a little bit as to why you talk of housing as a value and use a rights framework to talk about it?
Well, it's because the problems that we have are very a long term in the making, and what has occurred is that one kind of value has allowed to dominate without us really choosing for it to do so. And that's the value of housing as an investment or as an asset class or as representing something in terms of personal material wealth. Now, not for 1 second am I saying that it's wrong to value such a thing. Look at my family. Not wealthy people by any means, but they at least were able to establish some degree of personal material security through having a home, which they ended up buying, incidentally, from the position of initially renting it. But over a period of time, that one value, that value of housing as a thing rather than a purpose, I think has come to dominate the Australian housing system to such a degree that there's something quite bad about it. And we've allowed that to happen. It's happened on our moral watch. And I'm really saying that we need to morally watch differently. Housing needs to become the purpose of the housing system in terms of the human being rather than in terms of the money that might be made from it. Incidentally, it's not only housing ownership that's the issue here, or not only housing and investment as an investment class that's the issue here. It's the idea that the only way that you can have a secure home in which to live, to grow a family, to be educated, to obtain work is by owning one. Now that's not true. Rental housing, properly supported by good laws, glad to see those laws becoming better in the state of New South Wales, I read, is a form of tenure that many millions of Australians are going to have. About 2 in 5 of people who have rented accommodation now are not in the long run going to be able to own homes all the time or at all. So there's a moral imperative not just to understand housing as a system in terms of human need, but to understand that different kinds of tenure are a way of meeting that need. And we must not stigmatise tenancy as an inferior form of tenancy, and we must not have second-class laws reflecting that kind of stigma of rented tenancy as a form of housing.
So how did we come to this? Particularly, you make the case that, what is happening in Australia is quite unique, that other places in the world have similar problems, but we've got this particular relationship with land that has made our housing, well, you don't even call it a crisis, you go further, you call it a disaster.
I do. I noted that Rose called it an emergency, and it is. So I think she's shying away a bit from this term crisis, and I don't like to use the word because it suggests that this is a blip, that we can just turn a knob here and turn a knob there and things will be better overnight. And it's absolutely clear to people in this room, I don't need to tell you, that that's not so. So I think it is a disaster with emergency dimensions. You're right, I think. This is a difficult subject, Rob, and I'm reluctant to talk about this dimension because the way that Australia was established by a taking in order to implement a colonial project which involved the imposition of private property values upon a colonised country, and then literally the carving up through a system ultimately called the torrent system of land, parcel by parcel, without paying for it, and then distributing among the colonised people, I think creates a certain national consciousness about the importance of land in the continuing project of nationhood. And the reason why this is a difficult subject, I think, is that everybody wants to think of themselves as a moral human being, somebody who aspires towards and actually implements enlightened values. Now, this organisation and myself do that through a faith-based approach to their lives, and I would defend that approach. So the idea that there is something, as it were, dark there, not yet recognised, not yet dealt with, I think does have something to do with what I see and what people visiting Australia see as a certain unhealthy fascination with the idea of land ownership itself. It's as if the ownership of the land doesn't just represent a thing that's owned, but represents something about ourselves, as if we are not worthy without the owning. These, I think, are troubling ideas, and I go there gently and not in any determinative or affirmative way, but I feel I must refer to the colonial origins of Australia when we are talking about a housing crisis, which incidentally impacts far more heavily upon Indigenous people, having regard to the welcome that we just received, a generous and warm welcome. First Peoples in Australia are much more likely not to have homes, much more likely to be in rental housing, much more likely to be in inadequate housing, and that's obviously continuing injustice of colonisation. So this dimension of it, I think, can't be avoided. It's a moral dimension, and it's very much connected with processes of truth-telling and agreement making and other things which are certainly happening in my state.
Yeah, I should say, Kevin and I had a conversation yesterday, and we were talking about the terrain that was a bit more controversial to cover, and we've gone straight there. But it's great. But it's great that we do, because I was on the way in, I was in chat to Tone Wheeler. Those of you who haven't had a chance to meet Tone, hand up, Tone, where he's wearing black up the back. He's an architect, so he wears black. Tone up the back. A font of all sorts of wisdom, Delphic almost, but Tone was actually saying to me, that this country was built on, the dispossession of multiple nations and handing out land to, just down the road to MacArthur and co,
right here,
and built on this idea of dispossession. And from a faith perspective, it almost, it brings up the idea of original sin, that the idea that the foundations upon which contemporary Australia is built on a great historical injustice, and that sort of flows into the way in which we look at land.
It does, and it shows how deep the problem is, but it can be fixed.
So how do we do that?
Well, I think the first thing is that we need to understand that it's a multidimensional problem with a common foundation, which is this question of how of values about which we're discussing. What is the purpose of a housing system? What should be the legal policy and administrative means through which that purpose is implemented? The purpose of the housing system is to meet the needs of people. I contend for a person-centred approach to that system. One which places human need at the centre of attention. You've got that as your mission. I was really pleased to see that. All people, note the all, equally, everybody, leave no one behind. Find a normative system different to the one which has failed and helped to produce the problem that we have now, which reflects and implements that value. That normative system is human rights. The legal policy and administrative means through which that system can be implemented is to recognise the human right to housing, make that the purpose of the housing system, alter the administrative arrangements through which the system is administered, and most especially plan towards the meeting of the needs for housing of all people. Now, that's a different way of thinking about housing, and I do contend for a different way of thinking about housing. Philosophers call the way of thinking about something epistemology. We need a new kind of knowledge. Now, this is going to shift the balance, but it won't mean that there's no place for the market or people who have a moral purpose in the way in which they engage with the market. I'm looking towards a particular individual that I was speaking to earlier, who clearly has that moral purpose. But it does involve a different way of regulating that market. It involves a bigger role for government, a bigger role for community, faith and like-based organisations who see it as their role to meet human need and not just to make profit from that need. Not that that's a bad thing in itself, but we need a different balance across the whole of the system.
So a lot of the regulatory approaches that we're taking currently through the Housing Accord is saying that we need, as community and government, that the private market need to do heavy lifting for us, that the burden would be too great for government to do it alone. What do you say to that?
Well, I think it's... I personally consider it to be a fantasy that the same market-based mechanisms which have helped to produce the problem can be used as a way of resolving it. I think that's a fantasy. That's not to say that the main heavy lifting will be done by the market. I think it will. But for us to maintain a government effort of about 3% total housing value, which is a situation in Australia, I think is an appalling and unsustainable level of effort. There needs to be a completely different, much greater mix as between government and private effort. And this can only be achieved through government, and I think we need to begin at this level, Rob, at community level, if I might say so, because government needs to explain this to the Australian people. The Australian people at the moment are being invited to participate in a public debate which is really being dominated by economic notions of supply and demand. And one particular notion, which is important in and of itself, is being used to dominate the public consciousness about the nature of the problem, and that is that it's just a question of supply. Now, of course, if there was such supply as would be enough to meet the housing needs of the people, we could all just unite around that idea. But no government effort presently announced, even in the aggregate and taking into account the contribution of the states, is anywhere near enough to meet the needs of the population in the outlook period. Millions of people are going to be left behind if everything that federal and state governments have announced that they will do is actually done. Human rights is totally against that because it means that it's against the equality principle. It's against the principle that people equally have the right to housing. Leaving people behind with no plan, even in the long run, to meet their needs is wholly inadequate. So it's not just about supply. It's about the values that upon which the system is built. It's about where those values have come from, going back to the original sin that you mentioned. It's about the legal and other mechanisms that we have in order to implement our ambition. It's about lifting up that ambition. It's about upscaling the national governmental effort. It's about different legal and administrative mechanisms through which that can be done. Now, these are ideas driven by a different kind of national outlook. And so it's not just supply, it's about ideas and it's about moral responsibility. And what I'm suggesting is that the true solution to the problem is actually a moral one, and we need to go on a different moral watch to the one that we've been on. We have, in a sense, been morally asleep and just let the system run along in its own market way. We now need to wake up and take moral responsibility for the way in which it operates.
So, I mean, it's appropriate for me to raise a psalm, but there's a psalmist who says, "Turn from evil and do good, and you will live in the land, and you will dwell in the land forever." Mm-hmm. So, what are some of the things that we can turn from in a policy sense? Obviously, you've raised planning, and planning often gets referred to as the fount of all evil. What about tax? No one seems to like talking about tax. No. Is there anything that on the tax side of things? I mean, is land value fundamentally a problem? Do we need to look at how to? In one sense, when the planning minister, I used to joke that as a planning minister, you're really the minister for land value, because when you rezone land, it goes up in value.
Yes.
But there's a paradox there that by rezoning the land, making it more valuable, it's then less feasible to develop. What could be done to, or should be done, if you think, to actually look at pushing down land values to make development of housing more feasible?
Well, we could line up, I think, 10 or 20 individual policy measures. We had a go at this in a conversation yesterday. You spoke about the interesting one of halving the entry costs for low-income people into housing in Britain. An interesting idea. We could talk about planning. We could talk about tax. We could talk about Bill for Rent. We talk about facilitating modular housing as a different form of housing. We could talk about increasing tenancy protection radically. We could talk about a different lending criteria, as Senator Bragg has been discussing in recent days, altering the 3% gap between the interest rate that can be afforded and the standard rate. I could add a lot of things to the list, but Rob, I'm not here to pick policy winners. I'm going to answer your question in a moment, but I'm not here to pick policy winners because each of these areas involve issues of individual expertise and sometimes issues of intricate expertise about which there needs to be professional judgments made. What we really desperately need is for all aspects of the housing system to be brought together in a plan which enables those things rationally and coherently to be directed towards the human end for which I'm advocating. And the only way that can be done in a way that is enduring is through legislation. Of course, it could be done constitutionally too, but I'm not advocating for that in this country. I don't think that's appropriate. But it's certainly appropriate to be advocating for a legislative model through which that kind of overarching planning can be implemented on a national scale, including at the level of state government, including at the level of state and territory government and local government.
And you'd be pleased to know that Faith Housing Australia has been doing exactly that.
Has it? Okay.
Working with Hal Paulson and others
Right.
to push that idea of a legislative response.
Well,
Bill of Rights?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. All right, well, I applaud you in doing that, and no doubt you made a submission to the Senate committee.
Yep.
Now, the Senate committee rejected that bill last week, or rather the week before. It's a poor piece of work. It's a political piece of work. It doesn't deal with the merits of the proposal. I myself, I appeared before that committee, as did Hal. That proposal's not going away. The Senate committee can do what it likes with failing to meet the merits of this important proposal. It's not going away, and there will ultimately be a proper reckoning.
Good.
The government hasn't yet engaged with it, except in this kind of negative way. It hasn't discussed the merits, and it's trying to avoid any discussion about human rights. And I think that's a pity.
I take on human rights. It's interesting. Preparing for today, I looked up the Sustainable Development Goals, and they had an interesting history because they came out of the Jubilee movement, which was also pushed by people of faith.
Yes.
And when you look at that list 17 Sustainable Development Goals, a right to housing specifically is not one of them. Can you talk us through why that might not? It
is. No,
well, it's not listed in one of the 17. It's
goal. It's a target.
Yeah.
It's target 11.1.
Okay, in the cities one.
Yes, it is. It's target 11.1. It's. Forgive me.
No, but it's not one of the goals. It's not the 17.
The goals are very general.
Yeah.
And the Sustainable Development Goals are a mechanism through which governments can be held to account all across the world for the way in which they implement human rights. So they don't restate human rights, they restate goals through which human rights can be achieved. And therefore it's sometimes difficult to make the connection. I wonder if I could just get some...
sure.
Thank you. Nothing more annoying than tracking your voice.
No, sorry, I should be better organised. This is my first go at being...
Oh, it won't be your last. All right, let me put this down here and see if I can't knock it over. So housing is what we call a bedrock right, because without housing no other human rights can be realised. That's, I think, an obvious proposition, and probably a proposition which motivates the work of all the people in this room. One can't sustainably develop without there being a housing system which is the subject of national planning with an eye on sustainability as part of the issue, which is another policy area in respect of which I don't wish to pick a winner either, but it does illustrate how intricate the problem can be, because we don't just need to provide housing, it needs to be done in a way which contributes to the effort to save the planet. And that's fundamentally important.
That raises a good question too. In part of the debate at the moment, there are those voices who are saying, well, in order to achieve housing justice, we need to lower building standards, we need to lower standards around access to natural light or ventilation or those sorts of things. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, I do. The right to housing as a system is one that applies in the context of different societies throughout the world with different capabilities and histories, different economies, different standards of wealth and non-wealth, privilege and inequality, but a standard of habitability is central to the way in which the human right to housing is implemented. So there must be the housing, whatever be the form, whatever be the tenure, whatever be its kind, must be habitable, and that necessarily involves physical standards, including standards of light and air, standards of access to water and other like resources, standards of access to transport, education, work and so on. So this is why the right to housing has spawned what is called the right to the city. So it implies a different kind of urban environment, again placing people at its centre, and not just the economic fact of having a road or a house, but rather thinking about what the purpose of that thing actually is. Now, I've seen that argument taken too far. I have a right not to be overlooked by a place next door. I have a right to the maintenance of a view. I have a right to not just to sunlight, but to direct sunlight. I have a right not just to air, but to wind. These are things that would be answered differently in different societies and even possibly in different suburbs. But those who argue for the manifestation of the right to housing in relation to them individually, without taking into account the urban setting within which their house is located, are talking about them themselves rather than upon the right to housing of everybody. And the right to housing belongs to people individually living in community and society and in family, and questions of balance are involved. So it's not a right to necessarily to wind, to direct sunlight, to no overlooking, and so on. It's a right to housing or to home that is secure, that is safe, that enables one to live in dignity, and which is habitable.
So, in balancing those rights, there's always going to be conflict, and that's part of. And that's, in a democratic society we're used to those things. But how can we collectively better articulate the argument to reconsider our values, to look at housing as a right? What can we do to help? Because what you've described, it's as much about culture as it is about law.
It is. I am speaking about the cultural dimension of possessing rights of a particular kind. I am talking about that.
But sharing, never goes down necessarily very well. So how do we make that case publicly and win it?
Well, I agree with you that I wouldn't call it rampant individualism, but I'd call it individualism of an unhealthy kind, has come to be accepted as an aspect of housing aspiration. And it's almost as if everybody is just one step away from being an investor themselves, so that they're defining their life outlook in terms of that ultimate aspiration of possessing a home as an asset rather than as a place to be. Now, these are challenging ideas, and I don't think there's any easy way to engage in the challenge unless, except to do so in a respectful way and to point out the consequences of that kind of approach. And the consequences of that kind of approach are to render about 2 million people in this country insecure about their housing outlook over the next 2 generations. Now, I'm not speaking here rhetorically. I'm referring to the Productivity Commission's report of 2023, and I'm referring to the first report of the Housing Affordability Advisory Council of 2024. Those reports show the depth of the problem, and in human terms that means that there will be people in this room who are in exactly that position, or who have children in exactly that position, who are confronting real difficulty in terms of what their outlook is. And so I believe that pointing to the consequences of the system as it is presently organised, and having just this kind of forum with such an outstanding budding interviewer as yourself is a way of doing this. Yes.
Remembering one of your compatriots, Barry Humphries, once said he was born into a country where you went to the toilet outdoors and you had dinner indoors. Yes. And he said, I'm about to depart a country where you go to the toilet indoor and eat dinner outdoors.
Yes, well, that's a classic.
but he also said in the same interview where he repeated it, he said that one thing he had noticed that people's fences had got bigger.
Yes.
That and making an observation that property ownership needs to be more about excluding ourselves from our neighbours rather than including. What do you think has happened? Because over the period that your book has charted, I mean, there were particular conditions that led to the sort of mass public housing schemes of the immediate post-war period, but then that was consciously undone starting from the 1970s. What's changed in our culture to make us look at property differently, or housing differently?
Well, we need to unpack that interesting question. So let's talk about land, because I know that you're a former Minister of Planning, and of course this takes us back to the way country was established. Land was cut up, parcelled, developed and sold, so it became possible for everybody to own quite a large amount of land if we look at this in international terms. And the idea of having a block of land, be it a quarter acre or bigger or a bit smaller or whatever, but definitely fenced, came to represent the national ideal. Now, my parents had that ideal, and so the great step forward, which Curtin brought about by asking Chifley, in the name of human rights, to establish the Commonwealth Housing Commission, which led to all this, was one that was based on the idea that that ordinary working people would have access to that kind of housing. Now, the idea was not to use land efficiently because there was so much of it. It was to use what was there and then to make available to all that which until then only a few could have. That is, land as a place which could be fenced, on which a single home could be built. That was the great Australian dream.
And I mean, you explored this a bit in your book, but could you pull out one particular policy where things started to go wrong?
No, I couldn't. No, I couldn't. I mean, that it was, I think, too much to expect Chifley to understand that by bringing a quality to a system that involved everybody having land that was fenced, there would ultimately be a system of inequality in which people couldn't have access to that kind of land because there wasn't enough of it, the position right now. That would have been a big ask for him. Menzies said, well, we won't rent government land anymore or government houses anymore. We'll allow people to buy at discount rates and create little capitalists in every household. And people criticise him for that, and there are aspects of that for which I criticise him. But what he was really saying was that people can own and be proud of owning. That was his middle-class idea of what it meant to be Australian and successful, reinforcing the very thing about which I've just spoken. He wasn't talking about landlordism. He was talking about ownership. He wasn't talking about that which we now see as being such an important part of the housing system. The failure of government effort to maintain public housing construction, for which all political parties, not just one or the other, are responsible, in the last part of the 20th century, no, I reckon I'd put that down as my number one. Negative gearing and capital gains tax deductions, I think they've had a big part in creating the investment environment, which has contributed to the problem now. But the idea that we could just let the market run along, government will withdraw, housing will trickle down, those were ideas that became dominant in the last part of the 20th century, and I think that's where I'd point the finger of guilt most strongly. And of course what really trickled down was homelessness of the kind that we now see, which is a national disgrace.
So we've only got a couple of minutes left. I guess, you've got a room here of people who are motivated, who have talents, who have assets, the organisation they represent, and are willing to do our bit. Anything you'd point us to directly? Anything that, from your experience and training and perspective, that you could give us some advice? Yes,
I would. I would say start talking all the time about the right to housing and the need for a national housing plan based on legislating the right to housing. When you're with a minister or a government representative or anybody that is exercising any kind of power, talk about the right to housing. Sure, take the expanding resources which are currently being made available, take them and use them. The human beings are behind this problem. Those resources are resources which human beings need. But without a national housing plan based on legalising the right to housing, the long-term outlook is very poor. And nobody should be left behind. We can't just congratulate ourselves with making a stronger effort in funding or other terms, because the legacy issues are so great that we have to think differently in order to meet them.
When we were chatting yesterday, we talked about the idea of, we talk about housing as a right, yet we don't really, in this country, talk about water or air or these things.
Yeah, made that point.
But that might be a way that we can start to think about. I mean, the idea that there'd be unequal access to
water,
fresh drinking water or air
Yeah.
would be unthinkable, and yet with housing we sort of tolerate it.
Correct.
There's an American ecologist called can't remember his name now, Aldo Leopold, who once said, we abuse land because we treat it as a commodity belonging to us. Once we treat it as a community to which we belong, we're on the path to treating it with love and respect. It seems that that's sort of a bit of a missional statement for you and your quest for housing justice.
I think it is, and it would take us back to the values of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from whom the land was taken, who look at land in that very way.
So really your message to us is that what we're on about is actually a big quest to find justice in who we are and our history as well.
Correct.
It's actually bigger than
It's
about
much bigger
housing.
than housing. It is.
Yeah.
It's much bigger than just housing. It's a question of, well, you've said it well. I can't say it better than you.
Oh, yes, you can, and you did, and you wrote it. So if you haven't had a chance to purchase a copy of Kevin's book, can I commend it to you as some holiday reading? And could you join with me as I thank Kevin very much?
Can I, on behalf of all of us, thank Kevin for, when an academic and a justice was going to speak, I was not expecting you to talk about values and about dispossession and about call to a moral society, nor was I expecting you to refer to fantasy markets either. But that was one of the most profound speeches that I've seen on this topic for a long time. So thank you for joining us. I understand you have to now fly to your next appointment, but we really appreciate the time you took to doing it. Thank you. We'll just have a minor stand-up break because the next session involves Rob, who's actually just walking Justice Bell out the door. So if you want to have a stand-up break for a minute or two, it's not enough time to go out and grab a coffee, sadly, but certainly stand up, introduce yourself to neighbour. Yeah, I'll sit there. Thank you. Can I invite you to take your seats again? Lovely to hear such animated conversation too. Nothing worse than you go to an event and people say nothing to each other, so that's fantastic. Already the call to action is in action. We now have a panel of distinguished people who are going to talk about some of these problems and some of the responses, particularly from a faith perspective, and it's my privilege to introduce some of them, beginning with the Professor, the Honourable Rob Stokes, who's an urbanist, fascinated by places and passionate about people. He's an industry professor at Macquarie University and serves as chair of Faith Housing Australia and on the Australian Government Urban Policy Forum. Rob was the first ever Minister for Public Spaces and Australia's first ever Minister for Active Transport. He also serves as the Minister for Planning and Education, among other roles, in a political career that spanned more than 15 years. Hajeh Maha Karim Abdo, OAM CEO, Muslim Women's Australia and FHA board member. Maha is a passionate advocate for social justice and serves as the CEO of Muslim Women Australia, a representative body for Muslim women working to enrich humanity, advocating for equality and the rights of all women. Maha represents and gives voice to Muslim women abroad as well as in Australia. She advises government on policy, services and strategy. In 2015, Maha was a finalist for the Australian Human Rights Commission's Human Rights Medal. In 2014, she was the New South Wales Human Rights Ambassador. Reverend Stu Cameron, CEO, Wesley Mission. Stu brings us for today the voice of a faith thought leader. But if you know Stu, you know he's far more than that. He's a purpose-driven entrepreneur, a collaborative leader, and is passionate about advocacy and stewardship. He has led Wesley Mission since 2021, having previously served communities in Brisbane and the Gold Coast for 15 years. He brings a unique perspective to tackling some of the most significant challenges facing Australian society today, drawing on pastoral experience as a Christian minister. Dom Rowe, CEO of Homelessness New South Wales. Having worked in executive roles for organisations such as Greenpeace, the National Tertiary Education Unit, the Australian Council of Trade Unions, and more, Dom's career is focused on achieving changes for a better society. She has a strong personal commitment to ending homelessness and is thrilled to bring her high-level skills in strategy, communications, adult education, politics, research and policy to tackling the housing and homelessness crisis within the Homelessness New South Wales team. Charles Daoud, Director, Traders in Purple. Co-director and owners of Traders in Purple, Charles has over 20 years' experience across the design and delivery of complex projects within multiple sectors of the construction industry. A qualified engineer and builder, his skill for project management has been one of the foundations of Traders in Purple's success. Charles has a passion for improving lives of people in the communities for which he works and is a strong advocate for increased social and affordable housing. Leading the Traders in Purple pro bono initiatives, he believes strongly in the social and economic success of every community and supports the local employment for each Traders in Purple project. He is also a thought leader and innovator within the private sector of the industry. Now, before we begin the panel, I want to remind you about the QR code. So if you've got that brochure, hopefully you've got the brochure. Yes, no? If not, we might get... yes, some people are waving them. We might get some of them just dropped along the rows. We don't have the chance to get every single question answered, but there is a QR code, and if you scan it and you think about questions, then they'll be texted to me on stage and we'll get to ask some of the panellists those questions. So they're coming around now. If you haven't got one, share them with your neighbour if you don't, but there is a chance for participation before the Minister arrives too. I feel bad having followed Rob now. I feel like I'm going to be judged on who's the better interviewer.
It's a lot harder than you think.
It is, isn't it? But look, we have a fantastic panel. I'm going to cut to the chase. I've got so many questions here. But instead of talking about, because I know you're passionate people, motivated by faith, and you've wanting to do this problem, you've been talking about it for a long time and taking action. I'm going to cut to the chase and very quickly ask each one of you, and I might start with you, Stu. What changes would you like to see in the current housing system to better support individuals and families in need?
Well, I mean, I thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be a part of the panel. I was fascinated by Justice Bell's talk and really the overwhelming theme of morality, that we reframe the conversation here in Australia around housing as a human right, fundamentally, and that we base it in from my faith convictions in this understanding of the sacredness of human life and human dignity, that's foundational. So I think a fundamental reframing of the conversation, so it's less about economics and social policy, they're all very important, but there's a more fundamental question about how do we value human beings and what sort of nation do we want to be? And happy to talk about that more, but I think it's a moral conversation.
Thanks, Stu. Dom?
So I'm a very direct person, and I think one of the things we do need to do is talk about housing as a human right, because I think under that rubric we will get a lot of the things that need to change in the housing and homelessness system we've got. But critically, we need better investment in social housing for people across Australia. It's at a seriously low level, and it means that where we were at 1 in 3 homes being social homes, we're now at 1 in 20 homes being social homes. That is a real problem and a challenge for our society. I think it's a challenge that we can meet, but we all need to work on that together across the organisations that we have, the people that we have that are looking for some sort of new story for housing and homelessness. And the second thing we need is making sure that there's supports for people in housing, because it's more, to have a home is more than just having a house. It means that you've got skills and the capacities around you that enable you to keep that home in a way that you want to keep that home. And at the moment, we know that there are thousands of people across New South Wales and Australia that are not getting that support that they need to keep that home safe and secure with their families. And finally, we need to look a little bit more towards prevention. And I might talk about that in a little bit, but we often talk about housing as the thing, but actually there's a number of social structures and social systems that exist around housing that need to change. One of the things I'm really aware of working in homelessness is that actually we have a very low minimum wage and a very low welfare net, and that means that people can't access the private rental system, and so they can't get that housing as a human right because they don't have the income to be able to sustain that at the moment. So those are the 3 things I'd be looking for.
Maha?
Thank you. I think for the first time in my last 40 years in the community working, I'm actually feeling that there's a heartfelt, robust conversation around needs. And I'd like to see the shift moving from handout to actually hand up, right? So rather than us thinking, we want to change and shift the way that, housing is provided, because we're always thinking about where, it's like these people are so vulnerable and it's affecting all of us. And I feel sometimes, I know fear breeds that resistance, right? The resistance of, there's I own this. So it's about ownership. And how do we shift the mindset? We've got to start with really feeling of the heart that you don't need to own something to belong, right? So I think it's really starting to talk about the heart of the community, the heart of society, the heart of Australia. And I think it was touched on earlier with Rob and the Professor that, talked about we don't own the land, yeah? We are custodians of the land. So if that is something we start talking about and creating that safe space in a trusted environment, then I think everything else will fall into place. But you've got to start talking about the core of what it is that we as humans are all about, and stop blaming the problems on migrants. Stop blaming on the Indigenous community. Start owning what it is that we need to change and begin that process of collaboration, so that when we're actually working towards a plan for a better future, we work with the now and own the responsibility of taking accountability for how do we create that space. And everyone has different skills. Where we bring different skills into that space, I think this is where we become all it's ingrained in hearts that we own and we have a responsibility towards our neighbours. And I think that's one of the keys, is that the heart in the community.
Charles?
I could speak for hours about what we need to change.
Please don't.
I won't.
The minutes are going.
I won't. But look, I've come to the realisation, given our experience delivering all types of housing. And I think Justice Bell said it right or correctly, this thought of the trickle-down system helping people who can't afford a home, for example, to get into home ownership or even just to be able to rent a home, we've kind of got to do away with that. We can't undo the policies of the past because there are much bigger issues than just, well, not much bigger, but there are other issues to be considered as well, particularly economic issues and the health of the economy nationally, given so many of us are invested in property as a source of wealth. And I think what we need to do is silo social and affordable housing, which means we need to be delivering a lot more of it. I think another thing that we really need to be thinking about is, and I'll give you a bit of a construction analogy. Actually, this is one of the questions that you're asked when in your interview when you're getting a builder's license. I got one 20 years ago. I don't know if it's still the same thing, but basically you've got a laser level, a dumpy level, and you're shooting levels. Now, if that laser level's accurate or just about, anything at a short distance is okay. Everything at a long distance is okay in terms of accuracy. If it's out by a few mil, anything at a short distance is still kind of okay. You can't tell that there's an error in what you're looking at. But as you shoot longer and further away, the error can get more and more significant. And what's happened is that we've brought in these policies and we continue to bring in policies that fulfill short-term goals without looking and understanding at what it means for the big picture. And that's no fault of politicians. I think Justice Bell excused the Prime Minister of the day about not being able to have that foresight. But now that we've seen the consequences of that, and we've used words like crisis, emergency, I think Justice Bell's actually used the word catastrophe, we need to be thinking about long-term decisions. And that decision-making starts on a very granular individual level. And what that means is that the decision that I might make in what I do may affect the housing of one or hundreds or thousands of families in the future. So I think, the purpose of today's kind of thinking, what does it mean legislating housing as a human right? I think working that into the conversation of every decision made about economics generally, but certainly housing, will give us the best shot at actually having a much better future in Australia in housing.
I also know he only let politicians off the hook that were over 60 years ago too. He didn't let Rob or I or any of the other ones that have come off the hook. Rob?
Because I'm not really... I'm going to affect my electability here, but my care factor for that is very low. To say that actually if we could, and Charles, don't have a stroke on me, if we could drop land values permanently by about a third, that would make an incredible... I read something, a property economist the other day saying the Australian property market is overvalued by about a third. If we've attached so much value to land, it can't be valued anymore. That is, it can't create the context for human relationships and for people to enjoy. It's a bit like, grandma's silver vase. It's too precious to touch or use. We've sort of made land such an idol that we can't enjoy it as a community. And so if we could bring down its value somehow, which is incredibly politically unpalatable because so much of our wealth as a nation is tied up in it. But it seems to me that that's one of the biggest problems, that it's too expensive, which means that everything else is too expensive, which means that no one, particularly those who find themselves in a position of vulnerability, can afford to exist on it. So if we can bring its value down, I think that's something, not really a great election platform, but something I think would make a real difference.
We're starting to get some questions come through, and there's nothing worse than people start putting them through and not getting them asked. So they also have some pre-prepared questions. I'm going to mix a few of them up, if that's okay. And Stu, I'm going to start with you. You're a faith leader, a man of deep faith and faith in action. How do you view the concept of housing as a human right? And I'm going to tack on a question that's come from the group here. A young person starting their career, they want to rent their home, but they're getting a lot of pressure from their family circles to own property. has a personal value tied to assets, and I know that you see things from that perspective. And the question there was, how can I and young people generally aspire to hone ownership for its benefits without exacerbating the housing crisis? You could take the moral aspects of that as a faith leader.
Well, it's a big question, a couple of big questions. I mean, and I think, you know, we've been living and all of us have been part of a way of being now for decades that it's hard to actually see it from the outside looking in. I mean, I'm intrigued by the story we tell ourselves and the things that we value. So, for example, just in the last couple of weeks in the Herald, two of the articles that I've noticed, the median price of one street in Point Piper is $45 million. And that's obscene. But it was being celebrated. Pointing out the suburbs in Sydney where you don't need the bank of mum and dad to buy a house. The fact we're having that conversation, I mean, just stepping back and understanding what that actually speaks of, the system that underpins that sort of inequality. And I think, you know, we are sleepwalking as a nation into becoming a very different Australia to what we would aspire to be. The inequality that's growing, the intergenerational inequality that we're seeing, a lot of which is built off the back of housing inequality. And as I said before, I think, you know, from a moral perspective, you know, the sacredness of human life, this Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic faith understanding that we're all imbued with sacred dignity, that we're created in the image of God, is fundamental to that. And so housing as a human right is absolutely fundamental to that, because it's right at the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I think it's 14 of the 17 UN Sustainable Development things. It's fundamental to that. And then as a faith leader, speaking out against the injustice of, you know, I think of the Hebrew prophets, they would do two things. They would rail against inequality, but they'd also tell a better story. So as faith leaders, as people who are, informed by our faith, we need to tell a better story to our community. Before we're an economy, we are as a society, and we need to reframe it around those sorts of themes, I think. So to the second question, I think it's really important that we bring our faith to all aspects of our life, including our personal individual decisions. It's a hard one. It's a tough one to answer, to be frank, because we all feel the insecurity. But it's so imbued in our culture to have our patch of dirt, have our fenced area, and so I think that's one that we just have to personally wrestle with. Yeah.
Thanks, Stu. Maha, the Quran talks about we cast our grace upon those we choose to. It's about putting things into action. It's actually us to do things. You're a humanitarian leader. You've done amazing things in creating women's safety, particularly for very, very marginalised and vulnerable communities. What are the impacts of this crisis on those marginalised communities, and what would be the benefits of treating housing as a human right? And what would you guide us to do through your experience of...
I think we've got to go back to the original times of creating humanity. What is our purpose in this world? Is it to really, just increase our wealth? Because wealth is a materialistic thing. For me, as a person of faith, and to be inclusive of other people of other faiths, there is a purpose in this world where we're all together. We've got to start engaging from a very sincere place where we put our words into action in creating a safe, trusted space to talk about the things that we need to change. And before anything else, acknowledging that this world is temporary. So how much more do I want to live in this world? And what I want to leave behind. What is it that I want to take with me when I'm answerable in front of God? That's what drives me. That's my purpose. So therefore, I don't own anything in this world. And this is what drives me and drives the mission of Muslim Women Australia, is the fact that we are here for a purpose and we want to engage with purpose and working towards providing a space and homes, not just brick and mortar, and safety in a trusted space where people can grow the way they would like to grow, not the way that I want them to grow. So leaving that open, but providing that sort of parameters and boundaries as well. I think where we've left behind is that we've become so engaged and so mesmerised by I'm not saying we can't live without money. We need that, right? But COVID has brought us together on so many levels, right? Because we've seen that health is important, our mental health is so important. So how do we collectively really create a space where we talk about what is common to all of us? Yeah, and that is, I want my children to grow in a healthy way. So would you. So what is a common ground for all of us to really thrive? Thrive without just focusing on one particular thing, that owning that piece of dirt. Because that piece of dirt does not belong to me. It belongs to the Creator that created me for the purpose of living, but inclusive way of living, right? Not me and not you. I own this and you don't own. So that word, status is not about who we all are here in this world. That's what drives me. And I think, again, that issue of naming, shaming and blaming always puts someone that is bad, right? So therefore, it's not my problem. They are the problem. As long as we continue to say, you're the problem, it's not me, so fixing it's not my problem. So where I would like to see that drives us all together is that from sincere, deep place of our hearts, that we engage with vulnerabilities, but at the same time with strengths, and utilising what we say is a God-given right, is a human rights, that we've now talked about human rights, conventions and all of this. But really we are what we do, not what we say right now. Because we say so much and we hear so many things out there in the media that creates that division amongst communities where we, people of faith, need to bring back that united front of our purpose in this place and engaging with purpose and dignity and respect where differences are in. How do I put my differences aside, but really give hand up, not hand down?
Thanks, Maha. John, the Minister's just walked in, but I'm going to throw you this question from the floor anyway, a little bit controversial. It says, if the market can't fix social housing, how do we push for public investment? Should we consider higher taxes to ensure housing is a basic right, like we do for healthcare or disability support?
So I'm one of those people that thinks there's amazing opportunities at the moment to reform the housing and homelessness system. We are on the cusp of actually some very big changes. There's a constellation of forces that exists both here in New South Wales but also nationally that can lead us in the right direction. Recently we've done some polling and asked people what they think about housing as a human right and what they think about some of the government policies that are around, and it's absolutely delicious. And I think particularly for the Minister in the room, it's delicious information that the public is giving us. One of the things they say is that over 76% of people see housing as a human right and want it to be enforced. So they want policies that reflect that in Australia. What we need to do as the not-for-profit sector and as the sector interested in housing and homelessness more broadly is help to try and cohere some of those forces. One of the things we also know is that Australians think at a rate of over 70% for those that are owning their own home, that they're willing to see a drop in the value of their home if it means more affordability for all Australians. That's an extraordinary number. That is people in Australia saying that what they want is the interests of the community put ahead over their own personal interests in housing. But we're being sold a story at the moment that's not that story. And the question for all of us is, how do we change that story over time to really get the right message out there and get the right policies out there? So yes, actually having housing is a human right where every person has the opportunity to get job opportunities, health opportunities, have a home with their family, be connected to community is going to cost money. But many things cost us money in this world, and what it depends on is what we're willing to prioritise. And what Australians are saying, that they want housing prioritised. when you look at the various polls that go around at the moment, and most politicians in this room, or even ex-politicians in this room would know this, is that affordability is a real, cost of living is a real big issue for people. And when you ask them what that means, they're saying housing. That's the issue. That's the issue that they want fixed. So of all the issues that are out there at the moment, that's the one that we can really fix, that actually Australians support some real ambition. And if that means higher taxes, then that's what it means. If that means a shift in priorities, then that's what it means. Because what it means for Australians is they have better job opportunities, better health, better mental health, and a better sense of community. And I think that's what we all agree on.
Charles, you're wearing a few hats today, a person of faith, an advocate for human rights and housing, but also a property developer. How do you view the concept of human rights as a property developer? And from the floor, do you think that changing the approval process for affordable housing would assist in expediting housing?
Both very tough questions. Again, I could probably speak for hours on both topics. But one thing I just did want to say that guides me, but it's also reinforcing what Maha said so eloquently. I heard something. I watch a daily TV mass service that's broadcast on the internet from the States, and I was watching that, and one of the ministers was giving a sermon, and he said something which kind of stuck with me, which was, if only we knew how quickly people forget us when we leave, we would do more, or we would do less to please people and do more to please God. So I think that's kind of philosophy that I like to sort of live by. But in terms of sort of enshrining or putting human rights at the centre of property and property development, the issue is property developers need no qualifications. So we, as a sector, don't come into developing property with any sort of foresight or any sort of education about the purpose. The purpose generally is just, let's just make as much money as possible doing this. And for that reason, property developers are, to a very large extent, actually demonised. But today we're talking about how critical it is to build housing in the country, the right type of housing, how there's so many people who are doing without it. There's people sleeping in the tunnels at St James Station, there's people sleeping at Circular Quay. Well, all of these things are happening. When a farmer grows grain, we celebrate that farmer. And we want to help them when there's a drought, and we want to help them when there's a problem. When a property developer wants to develop property, he's greedy. She's greedy. They're demons. They're coming here to ruin our community. So I think that that's quite a big challenge that we actually do come up against. Sorry, what was the second question?
Well, it was a specific question around whether or not changing the approval processes would assist in the expiry.
Okay, I'm going to give you a very quick anecdote, and I'm glad that Minister is here, Clare O'Neil, because it's great for you to actually hear this. We work across the country, and there's in lots of different jurisdictions. We heard about this HAF, Housing Australia Future Fund, that was coming up. So we said to ourselves, as a private organisation, you know what? We're keen to make a difference. We're keen to build our next affordable housing project, and we're keen to try and get some HAF funding to do that. So we bought a block of land. I went to the council and I challenged them. I said, I need an approval in 60 days. It needs to be shovel ready, because if it's not, we're going to miss round one applications of the Housing Australia Future Fund. And the council said, we are with you, we're supporting you. And you hear murmurings in the background about how they're starting to look at affordable housing, and they've changed some of their policies at a local level. So we got a DA in 38 days, and we put it forward, and it hasn't yet been announced. Not many of the projects have been announced yet, Minister, but this particular project, we are now at contract negotiation phase. Had the council not come to the party, we wouldn't be there. And the 60 homes that we're delivering on this particular property would not have been delivered. Genuinely, we probably would have found some other use for the land, right? So how important is planning? Planning is everything when it comes to housing delivery. Now, there's all sorts of other things that happen in the background and other things that you need to face for finance, legal, community, environmental. All of those things need to be considered, certainly, but planning is the key to unlocking, I guess, that one of those very last doors to opening the floodgates or unlocking the gate to open the floodgates for housing. So planning is extremely important. In New South Wales, we're celebrating Housing Delivery Authority with an approval in 270 days. It's still not good enough. I got a DA in 38 days. We're going to get some HAF funding. We're going to build 60 homes. That's all within a year and a half. And that's what we need for social affordable housing, but just housing generally.
Rob, we're almost out of time. You're going to get the last question. So there's so much in this group. And for those of you who put questions, what we might do is actually circulate them around to the panel and collect a few of the answers, and we'll put them on our website. So please don't think that if your question didn't get answered, it's not important. So I'm going to throw you a double one, Rob. I'm not sure which one you want to finish on, so I might start with the one on the floor first, because I think you'll want to finish on the other one, but it's a tricky one.
I just want to listen to Maha more.
How can politics focus more on values rather than incremental policies? And what role do you see Faith Housing Australia creating change on this issue?
I can throw that one back to you, Graham, because as to take from Charles, that sermon you were listening to about how quickly we're forgotten, but I'll just reflect on that. But I think as I reflect on my time in politics, and maybe the terrifying thing about it is it actually is a values game, and ultimately people generally don't really look terribly much at what your policies are. They actually look at who you are and who your team is and get a sense of them. I've done some reading on what motivates people to vote, but the promise of getting free stuff or those sorts of things, or fear, can be a motivator, but it's actually, to lead a conversation about values politically, you've got to demonstrate them. And maybe that's a call for us collectively as well in the role of Faith Housing Australia. Certainly one thing that people may have heard me talk about this, but I thought that with Kevin Bell talking to us earlier, he talked about framing it in terms of rights. I think people listen to us when we talk about other people's rights. They talk about us less. They think less when we talk about our rights. And I think for faith communities, the moment faith community started talking about our rights, I think the community stopped listening to us. Talking about housing is an opportunity for us to use our collective, different, beautiful variety of faith traditions to talk about other people's rights, and that's our role.
Thanks, Rob. Please thank our extraordinary panel. Rob, can I invite you to the podium?
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Graham. It is now my absolute pleasure and delight to be able to welcome the Minister to address us. And in doing so, I want to introduce the Honourable Clare O'Neil MP, Minister for Housing and Homelessness. Minister, we deeply appreciate your presence here in Sydney, especially after the monumental last sitting week of the year. We've already heard from Graham how many MPs want to be, not necessarily want to be, but have to be at school assemblies and those various things. So it's an incredibly difficult time of the year. You had an incredible sitting period, and your attendance underscores to all of us here just how much you value our collective contribution, and we are very grateful to you for spending your limited time with us. Minister, since being sworn in at the end of July, you have done a huge amount. You've already announced almost 14,000 new social and affordable homes as part of the Housing Australia Future Fund Round 1, including a number of successful bids from our members. And you've successfully navigated what seemed an improbably difficult process to get the Help to Buy and Build to Rent reforms through Parliament, which is historic, and we are very grateful and full of admiration for what you've achieved there. We commend how seriously you take your work and the way in which you recognise this as a pivotal moment to reshape Australia's housing future. We appreciate your ambition. At the scale of our housing emergency demands bold vision and substantial investment. and we acknowledge the immense challenges of your role, especially in the current economic climate. We're very grateful that you're spending time with us today, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Well, hello everyone. How are you? I just love this panel discussion. Can we give them all a round of applause? That was absolutely fantastic. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also acknowledge any First Nations people who are here with us today. And I want to thank you to Professor Rob Stokes. You wear a lot of hats, Rob. Professor, politician, faith leader, I absolutely love it. I want to thank Faith Housing Australia, the board, and the wonderful team who have welcomed us already this afternoon. And I can see lots of wonderful familiar faces around the room who I've already had the great pleasure of working with in the 4 months since I've been Australia's Housing and Homelessness Minister. And for those of you who I haven't met before, I see this as a wonderful partnership and the beginning of a beautiful friendship between us. Some of you in this room have been involved in housing for many decades. I'm newer to the portfolio, but bring hopefully some political experience to some of those big challenges that we're hassling it out in the Parliament. So I just want to pick up on where the panel left off talking about values. It's so fascinating for me as a politician to hear questions that assert that there aren't any values in politics. That's so foreign to me as a politician. In fact, the whole reason that I'm in politics, and I do see this for most politicians, is completely values driven. I was raised in a very religious household. I don't speak much about that in public, but I was raised in a very Catholic household. I went to Sunday school every Sunday. I was raised and educated in the Catholic system, and that entire ethos really for me as an Australian was about living a life that's for others. I understand how a lot of people look at politics and don't see the connection, but I always have. Politics for me is about using the skills and capability and the energy that I have to try to make big, bold change for my country. And when I look around at all the problems facing us today, I'm always attracted to the areas where I see the biggest challenge. And there is no question in my mind that the most crucial problem that we face and the most crucial moment to be tackling that problem is in housing right now. The panel talked about the uniqueness of this particular moment in politics where we actually have permission from the community to do some things that may not have been possible a decade ago, and I very much intend to take those opportunities where I can. So I don't need to tell anyone in this room that safe and secure housing is absolutely pivotal to leading a fulfilling life here in our country. And Australia's housing system has not been delivering that for too many Australians for too long. There are lots of complexities in housing that I know you in this room are very expert in. But when we look at the single biggest problem that we face in housing in this country, it comes down to something somewhat simple, and that is for really more than 30 years in our country, we haven't been building enough homes, and we haven't been building enough homes of all kinds. We haven't been building enough homes that are affordable for ordinary people to buy. We haven't been building enough rental homes, and we haven't been building enough homes for people who are always going to need a bit of extra support from the community and from the government to have safe and secure housing. And so we see the impacts of this all over the country. We see it in an entire generation of young people who feel that they are locked out of the housing market. We see it in very many young people who have bought a home at a very, very high price and today are struggling to find a way to properly and sustainably feed their families because their mortgage is so high. And we've got that 120,000 people, which I think is a pretty significant underestimate, through the census who are reporting that they're homeless, who are couch surfing, who are sleeping rough, who are staying with friends. Now, one of the biggest failings when I see all the problems in this undersupply is that we have a threadbare housing safety net. Social housing is now about 3.8% of our national housing stock, and I'm not sure we can seriously consider that to be a safety net anymore. So these problems aren't easy to fix, but I do want to just say something really positive because there is one thing that I see has really substantially changed about this in pretty recent times. If you look at the history of housing policy in our country, really from the post-war period, the Commonwealth has been on this steady march away from housing policy. We've had governments that have really progressively basically said we want to have less and less to do with this problem and take less and less responsibility. And some of you would have been involved in the housing discussion back in 2013, where the Commonwealth made a pretty radical move to say we are removing ourselves from this conversation altogether. And for most of that period under the previous government, we didn't actually have a Commonwealth Housing Minister. And I say that not to be political, but just so you can see that something really big has shifted here with the election of the Albanese government 2.5 years ago. If you like it or not, today our country is led by a person whose access to safe, affordable public housing in his childhood changed the course of his life trajectory, and today that person leads our country. And in my view, that is something that every single Australian should be proud of. So what has the Commonwealth done in that last 2.5 years? Well, we've stepped up into that national leadership role again, where we're working with states and territories and local government. I wish sometimes we didn't have to do that, which much respect to you, Rob. It would be lovely if one level of government was responsible for housing, but we do have those 3 levels, and coordinating and galvanising action between those levels is a big part of our government's agenda. So it's working with the states to cut red tape, to invest in housing infrastructure and boost land supply. As you know, we've introduced some measures to try to help low-income young people into home ownership and substantially expanded some measures that were in place when we came to government. We've encouraged the investment in the supply of rental properties and boosted rent assistance so that 1 million Australian households are now getting in the order of a 45% increase on Commonwealth rent assistance than they were when we came to government. And importantly for the people in this room, we are doing a lot of work to try to begin that process of rebuilding the social and affordable housing safety net. And I really want to just dwell for a moment on the critical role that I see faith communities in helping us undertake that work. Rebuilding that stock of public, social and affordable homes is going to be a really big part of the task ahead for those of us that are deeply concerned about housing for Australians. We need partners to help us do that, and we're seeing lots of activity from the state governments around the country and also from the community sector. And I just want to spend a bit of time talking about the Housing Australia Future Fund, which we heard a little bit about earlier. This fund is, of course, open to state, local governments, to community housing providers and to territory governments. And really what the Housing Australia Future Fund is it's like a national competition. We're almost saying to the country, for everyone who's interested in housing, we want to stimulate your ideas and your concepts for how we can start to get more social and affordable housing online. Our government's committed to building 55,000 new social and affordable housing under our programs. And in that first round of HAF, we set ourselves the target that we want to try to fund 8,000 social and affordable homes through the first round of HAF. As you know, we almost got to 14,000 in that first round. And that really speaks to the fact that we got lots of fantastic projects coming to us from partnerships around the community. And one of the biggest winners that I can see when I look at the successful applicants for round 1 is community housing providers and particularly faith-based organisations. So about 1 in 10 of the projects that got successfully funded in round 1 were attached to a faith-based organisation. So I want to say thank you to those of you who are in this room, because you are stepping up and you are doing something incredibly important by showing leadership and really pioneering this important movement. And I want to say to religious communities around the country, we want to work with you to be able to do more of this. We have got faith congregations around the country who are desperately concerned about housing, as you are and as I am. And of course, one of the things that we see that is such an incredible asset that faith communities bring is well-located land. Often when we go around the region, we go to suburbs around the country, the best land in those local communities is owned by churches and other faith communities. Now, I see faith communities doing incredible things in housing. I see crisis accommodation for women and children being provided in the most incredibly beautiful way to people who are really in trouble. I see faith-based organisations doing extraordinary things for young people who have fallen into homelessness through no fault of their own. And I see faith-based communities doing amazing intensive support for people who are in a situation of long-term homelessness. I see this as part of a growing movement in our country. We've got the NIMBY movement, of course, we've got the YIMBY movement, and this is that YIGBY movement, the Yes in God's Backyard, where we're seeing those beautiful faith communities saying, you know what, we've got a church car park here and we like to park our cars in it, but guess what? People need housing and we can actually come forward and support this fantastic thing. So bids in the first round of Housing Australia Future Fund were supported by local parishes who are absolutely part of this YIGBY movement. We saw people literally say their church's old car park was going to be turned into housing, and these are projects that we've been able to support through the Housing Australia Future Fund. Religious communities, of course, bring so much more than land. The other thing that we saw from a lot of the applications that came from religious groups is this fantastic ability that communities have to bring in other sources of funding. Some of it's from philanthropic organisation, some of it's from charitable donations. So all of this adds together to mean that for every taxpayer dollar that we put into social and affordable housing, we're actually getting more housing outcomes at the other end, and that's something that government absolutely cannot do alone. There's another example that I want to make you aware of, which is the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation investment in BAPT Care, where we provided $70 million in funding for community housing, which was used to establish 162 social and affordable homes in New South Wales. Just another fantastic example of a religious and faith-based organisation which has found a way to bring land, is bringing that expertise of working with the community and working with people in need and working with government who can usually provide that funding to basically make those projects economic. So I'm here to tell you that our government wants you to crowd back in to this sector. We really do want and need your help in trying to rebuild this stock of social and affordable housing. We heard a little bit about the Housing Australia Future Fund up the front here. Everyone was very polite and didn't point to the fact that there would be a desire in the part of the community sector for us to move more quickly on the HAF. And I just want you to know that I've heard that very loud and clear. One of the things I really believe in is, the Housing Australia Future Fund is a big, dynamic, huge new idea for our country, $10 billion that will support 30,000 social and affordable homes over the long run. It is a new thing for our country to do, and so we've done that first round, got sort of flushed out what is going to work for all of us, and we should be able to move a bit more quickly from here. There are further funding rounds of the Housing Australia Future Fund that we'll announce soon that will look at things to happen in 2025. So we'll share that information through Faith Housing Australia, but I'd really encourage all of you to be thinking about what assets your community brings, what do your congregants and the supporters of your community want you to be investing in, and then come talk to us, and we would love to talk to you about how we can work together on projects. Yesterday, I also released the investment mandate for $1 billion that our government gave to the National Housing Infrastructure Facility, and this is extra funding which is going to go to crisis accommodation for women and children who are fleeing family violence, and also for youth homelessness. So we are just finalising the detailed guidelines also on that fund. Again, we'll share that through your organisation and make sure that you all get access to that. I really see incredible things being done by faith communities supporting women and children who are in these awful situations, and I'd love to get more in on the opportunity. So can I just end with this? I really want to thank all of you for showing the tremendous leadership that you're showing in trying to help us with this housing challenge that we have as a country. I've been in my role for about 4 months. I have been genuinely and pleasantly surprised by the engagement of churches in the critical issue for Australians. I just love what you guys are doing, not just churches, but all faith communities. We heard on the panel here some real leadership on the policy side, and I think that's really important. Don't ever be afraid when there's a minister in the room to take the chance to really just open it up and share your views. I really appreciate that, and the practical support that you are giving in actually housing Australians is, really being noticed by the community, and I want to commend you for that. And please know that on behalf of the Commonwealth, you have a very willing partner in us. We are really excited to see the calibre of projects that you guys have put forward to work with us on housing. And I want to move not just from NIMBY to YIMBY, but from NIMBY to YIGBY. Everyone get that? Yep. I think it's a fantastic concept, and I really want to thank all of you for having me here today. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of a chance to chat, but wonderful to be with you, and I hope the rest of your conference goes well. Thanks, everyone.
Minister, thank you for not only attending today, but for your words and for, it's not always easy, acknowledging that we have a crisis in this country. recognition that I think your words were we have a threadbare social housing safety net for only 3.8% of the stock, and your personal commitment to doing something about that. And also thank you for talking about values and for touching your own faith perspective. We really appreciate your time and energy coming and doing this, but also your personal commitment to find more ways to invest in housing. A friend of mine, Manishankar Iyer, who's an Indian politician, once said to me that states endure, Graham. I was talking to him about changes in issues, but older than states, of course, are faith communities. So states endure, faith communities have been even longer. And we appreciate your recognition of that, and we'd like to extend our chance to Faith Housing Australia and to continue an ongoing dialogue with you personally and with the government as we address these challenges. You referred to your call that you'd bring your skills and capability to make big, bold change in this country in housing. And I think that's a call that we all have. Everyone in this room would like to bring their skills and capability to make big, bold changes to create housing justice in this country. Thank you for joining us today, Minister. That brings a conclusion to our event. We didn't get a chance to really thank our panel, but can I really thank them as well? There's some deeply moving concepts. And on a personal note, Charles, 36 days, I think I've just got one approved after 12 months. So you'll have to share with the rest of us what you did to do that. I think that would be a valuable contribution to the sector. But thank you to everyone coming along today. The Minister will be here for a short period of time if you get the chance to talk to her. She said she'd be happy to do that. But I encourage you to talk to each other, share information. It's by coming together as a faith communities or people of faith and organisations of faith that we can influence and change housing policy in this country. Thank you.